Gunter, why don't you kick off our session, and thank you.
Cover some of the topics you've seen already so far today, but more of a Q&A. We decided not to do any slides, and if you guys don't offer questions, I've come prepared. But to my left here is Allison. Allison is a lawyer. Don't let her poise and polish fool you, because she is a ferocious advocate for her clients and deals with inspection as well as filings prior to regulatory approval. Next is Sanjeev. He's an entrepreneur. He's lived through all of this sort of stuff and is living through it again. He's doing the commercialization of a point-of-care device, which I've looked at and really think that there's a lot to talk about there. And then on the end there is Natalie. Natalie is an expert. She's not only impressive in person, she's extremely impressive on paper as well. I can't tell which one's more impressive, but she can help you get through the regulatory briar patch by doing things the correct way. And then myself, Gunter, I'm a consultant. I do a lot of development and speaking on sales and marketing issues in the new normal in healthcare, pointing out your pitfalls and opportunities because of that. All right, so that's quick and easy. Let's start it off with a discussion here on just building on what we just saw, which is the increasing regulations in the EU and the US. I'll leave this to Allison and Natalie just to start off with. Of course, Sanjeev, jump on in here. But what do you think the meaning of these increasing regulations are? And what do you see that's good and bad about this risk-based approach? And how should device companies adapt?
Let me paint a little picture maybe of sort of the enforcement landscape with the medical devices kind of right now. And to those of you who are familiar, FDA kind of puts out this dashboard of its enforcement activities. And what we've seen, am I loud enough? And what we've seen is sort of the steady, increase in inspections and enforcement actions, since, I guess, really for the past 8 years. Has anybody been, subject to FDA inspection, kind of been through that process, know what that is like? Right. Good. Well, you're familiar. I think we see the same types of observations in the inspections that we've been seeing as far as complaint handling, medical device reporting, sort of CAPA systems. What we're seeing a little bit more of is supplier controls, right? And that makes sense given the sourcing from China and a lot of the contract manufacturing actually that's going on in China. And as well as what we see in China is a much more increased focus on the GMPs, the good manufacturing practices. So not just from the U.S. perspective, as far as U.S. having FDA folks and resident posts in China, but the actual China authorities paying a little bit more attention to the GMPs, also increasing potential criminal penalties over in China. Actually, this month too, we're starting to see also these kind of pharma-like consent decrees. Are people kind of familiar with consent decrees and the history of those? Well, there's been a couple issued somewhat recently, the past couple months. One for Maquet, it's a German-based company, and then one for Medtronic sort of last week. So we're seeing this pharma-like, and by that I mean these consent decrees are pretty onerous, require a lot of third-party involvement, so from a baseline audit to submitting a work plan to FDA, then you've got to go through this certification process, and then after your certification process, you have annual audits for up to 5 years. So that process, I've consulted clients through that process. It's not a fun one. It's very costly, and sometimes it can last sort of up to 10 years. But kind of what does that mean for the smaller manufacturers and some of the folks sort of in this room? And I know we've heard last night from Rhonda and sort of again today about sort of the better, cheaper, faster model, right? Getting out to market as soon as you can. But I would like to note that really maybe without that better piece, without that quality piece, you're not going to necessarily be able to stay on the market.
No, you're absolutely right. One of the things I've seen actually in China and in countries like India, the US FDA has gotten a lot more involved getting people and the regulators there trained, because a lot of the products are being exported out and coming here. And so US FDA has taken a more proactive approach, getting training done. I know in Mumbai and in Delhi and in Shanghai, Beijing, they have offices to train people to do these kind of audits, as well as get the regulations more in alignment throughout the world. And that's something which is starting to take place now. And we are starting to see that with what we are trying to do at POC. As we move through the FDA process out here, some of the work that we are doing out there is going to be relevant here. And so it's important for a company which is trying to go global is to get into alignment with these regulations which are relevant for different countries.
So I want to reiterate that and kind of give a different slant on it as well. So one being that, especially as the startup companies and smaller organizations, as well as the larger organizations, everybody's got the pressure to get it out there as quickly as they possibly can. But I think that there's some certain things you want to establish early on, and that's the basic bones of your quality management system. And that does not need to be hundreds of procedures, thousands of pages, but it does need to meet the basics for design controls, risk management, purchasing controls. When we go in and help companies that are startup companies in particular to set up quality systems, we don't come in and set up all the procedures in the first week, because that's not a manageable thing. But you want to get that framework set up, and that helps you not only with FDA, but also with a lot of the other parts of the world, because there is an increasing level of regulation in pretty much around the world. Just like there was a statement about there are actually regulatory agencies in many parts of Africa. There are increasing regulatory requirements for IVDs in Asia. There is pretty much around the world, there is an increasing level of both pre and post-market regulation. So in order to be able to take advantage of that and to be ready for that, you need to establish your quality system early on. So that's the first point I want to make. The other is to try to build your regulatory strategy early on. And I think we can talk about that more as we go along, but I think that someone talked about it earlier, Bob, I believe, about that it's a strategic function. And I really encourage you to think about that regulatory strategy. Where is it you want to go? Why do you want to go there first? What's the pathway? And it is a moving target around the world, not just in the U.S. So.
Yeah, we actually discussed this kind of parenthetically or as a sidebar, but you express it. Many of the device companies you work with will say, I'll put, what are the current regulations? I don't want to get ready for the next ones because I'm going to sell my company. And the question would be, well, are you ready for the cram down in value that's going to cause on that liquidity event? And it kind of builds onto the second part of this question, which is, so, this increasing regulatory environment creates a series of pitfalls and potential opportunities, but what does it really mean for those, for a medical device company as far as navigating? What do we need to stay away from? What do we need to capitalize on?
Well, I think sort of building on Natalie's point is, and actually the gentleman who spoke earlier on design, controls, I think really setting up in your quality system, you've got to have a pretty strong design kind of control around the product development. I know it's probably easier said than done, but it's required for your 510K submission, and then it'll become very relevant post-launch in the inspections. And I think a common pitfall would be maybe not considering all the different elements of the design control during the development phase, and then that translates into sort of product quality issues on the market. And then those negative product quality issues can really be costly and just very detrimental, especially to the smaller companies, whether that's in the form of having to do sort of product correction, recall, or a warning letter.
So let me take it from a different standpoint, from a startup standpoint, and I've gone through a number of startups. In my current startup, I had this dilemma of when do we start the regulatory process, because that's a lot of expense to take on. And when you're starting a company, you're raising maybe 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, and do you spend the money on putting the regulatory stuff together, or do you spend the money on developing the product? And that's according to different people that you talk to, it is, well, you need to have this stuff together right from the beginning. Sometimes it's actually better to go ahead and develop something and then go back and you've proven your concept, and then go back and get the additional capital that you need based on that, and then go back and do a lot of the redesign, because now you got enough money to go back and do that. Otherwise, if you start right from the beginning, well, you'll never have a product developed. So when we started POC, we had to go through this analysis, and a lot of the FDA guidelines say, well, you need to have thought about this right from the beginning. Well, yes, but I don't have the money for that, right? And so it's this balancing act, and if there are startups out here, entrepreneurs here, you have to think about that.
I want to respectfully disagree with that. I think that, and I run into this all the time, especially with, I hate to say it, but especially with software companies. I come in and we're ready to submit our 510K, and they don't have a stitch of documentation. And now there is this big delay to go off and write the documentation afterwards, and it is never as good. And then for sure, that process is not helpful to designing the product. If you actually use the design control process the way it's intended to be, which is not just to fill a bunch of notebooks or pieces of files on a computer, but to just help you to design the proper product, to take into account the users, to take into account the regulatory, to take into account the risks, the documentation can facilitate that, and it will not hold you up at the end.
No,
so
Natalie,
I absolutely disagree with, let's go design the product, get it out there, and then try to fill in the paperwork.
No, I'm not saying that. I agree with you, but the point is you need to make sure that the concept is working. And if you've got $50,000 and it's going to cost you $30,000 to put a software package which will help you get all those forms together, well, you're never going to get this product designed. You won't get the investors to come in and give you the money to take it to the next stage. Mm-hmm. So that's the balancing act that you have to take into account. We had to do that. Now, that doesn't mean we did not take into account putting everything that we were designing on paper, but documenting each and everything where we know the design isn't yet final, and it's not going to be until we have created the concept and then we move forward with a design development plan is not going to work.
Well, maybe ask it this way, sort of maybe in not following sort of the formal design control process, kind of what are you doing, and maybe what could other people be doing to ensure the product quality throughout that design phase once the product is sort of out on the market?
So this is the concept phase. The concept phase is where you do this. That's not the product phase. That's the concept. Once you've got the concept working, then you go in and start designing the product. So there's a design of the product phase, which is after that, where you need to take into account all of these things. And that's the thing that needs to be distinguished, and most people don't.
So, Sanjeev is making a point that it's from napkin to prototype.
Right.
From prototype to design product is where we need to start getting a little bit more formal and put together. But Natalie makes a great point about software, and that poor documentation on that is a state of nature. Yeah. So get it right, because software is a medical device.
And I've personally been involved with several products, both with software in the product and software-only products. You go in there convinced they're done, or, they only got a few more sprints to go. They have no idea what their product is going to do yet. And so, maybe that speaks to your concept. The point that I think is essential is that until you really establish solid design inputs, you really don't know whether you're done or not. And that is the place that's critical, because you can say, I'm done because we did our 3 sprints or our 5 sprints or whatever, and that's all we got money for, but you probably won't have a product. And the company, I saw this happen. They were sure they were going to submit their 510K in February of last year. It isn't submitted yet, and in fact, they didn't have the proper input from the users. And I think that was one of the other gentlemen that spoke earlier today talked about that. That's a really critical thing. They didn't know what is the market. They're who's going to buy it, who's going to make those decisions to buy it, what do they need, what problem are you trying to fix for them?
Yeah, and Natalie, you're absolutely right. Those are things which people need to know before they go about even working on a concept. You get that. We were doing the same thing when we knew what we wanted to do. We were going after breast cancer tests. We came up with the concept. We had to design this. Now, is this the design which will go into the market? No. This is the initial concept design. After this, we get into the design phase where we are starting to look at how are we going to take this into the market and who's going to use it and things like that. So the launch of the product needs to take into account that concept phase as well. So if someone comes in and says, hey, in 2 years I'm going to have this product into the market, they're kidding themselves. They need to take into account the concept time as well, because that's another probably 6 months or a year before they can bring it into the market.
I think that's a great transition point too, because just the idea that we're now going to sell it into whatever environment is being challenged today. So I think the one core theme from the first half of our discussion here is that regulatory burdens are increasing. You better keep your eye on that ball. If you don't, it'll bounce and hit you in the face. The second
we should mention, I don't know if we mentioned that we're welcome sort of questions from the audience as you think about them.
Well, their blood sugar's low. I'm looking at their face.
That's right. Feel free to jump in if you have a question.
Or just bask in the
comment.
brilliance. It's going to be okay. You got a question there.
It's not a question, it's more of a comment. So business school is completely foreign to me, but I have some experience in software development in the tech industry, and particularly with mobile applications and mobile devices. And so what I'm hearing is that maybe you're iterating often, right? There's this iterative stage where you're prototyping, you're pre-alpha. And I guess what I'm hearing in your comments is sort of, at what point do you sort of lock it down and say, now we're ready to present this to a regulatory agency and have the documentation in place?
Well, I don't think that's the issue. The issue is, where do you lock it down and say, okay, now we need to start creating a product out of this, and then you start creating the documentation. Because if you say, I'm ready to go into FDA now, and she's right, you don't have the documentation, you have to go back to the drawing board, and that doesn't work. So there's a point where you've proven the concept, then you start building on the rest of it and proving that the market is there, etc. Right?
I think there's the point that I'm trying to make is that not that you have to lock it in. Just because you wrote it down doesn't mean that it couldn't be changed. That's why they make letters of the alphabet, so you can revise your requirements, revise your information. What I have seen is that people get very far down the path, and then they try to go back and write design inputs and requirements, and it's very hard to write them once you've already got it designed, so that they just talk about what and not how. They sound a whole lot more like the hows and more of a design documentation and not a design input, and that happens because they don't do that upfront work. And one of the other gentlemen talked about that. I think that upfront work is very valuable. I'm not against or opposed to saying that that should be informed by feasibility work and potentially even feasibility clinical studies. What I'm trying to advocate is that it can be incorporated in the design control process, and that the intention shouldn't be that you do everything and then you sit down and write your documentation, because this will save time. And in my experience, it doesn't save time.
Jay has a question.
Yeah, we also do some of the design work for our customers. In the first phase, what we call alpha product release, where customer gives a problem statement and we have to come out with a couple of ideas. So when we come out with a couple of ideas, then customer, along with his customer's customer, they pick one of those ideas. That's what we call alpha phase. And then one of those ideas that is picked or selected by customer, then we take it to next level. So in that second phase is what we get into design, control, etc. Whereas the first phase, where we develop 2-3 ideas, I don't think we go through the design and control. So that is that okay?
That's right. That's right. That's exactly what I'm saying. Because a lot of people you talk to, they say, no, you should start from ground zero. And yeah, you could do that. That would be ideal if you knew exactly the phase you're going to go into right away. But if you have to do that selection, you have to initially go in and check out the different phases and then determine which one you want to go through.
Brett has a question.
Hi, thanks. So one thing about the design, particularly from a startup point of view and the early stage when you have no resources, it is still something that we found very, very important, that you understand your customer, right? And so even if you're not doing a formal design process, you want to do as good as you can in that 6 months when you're just getting started to figure out exactly why you have a company.
Right.
So I think that again kind of completes the loop, because this knowing of the customer as well as how do you prepare for things. We're in a transition in healthcare in the U.S. from volume-based healthcare to value-based healthcare. We're globally, looking more at risk and regulatory environments to try and protect patient populations, again, to try and maximize the value output from the healthcare dollar spent. The EU CE marks are not as easy to get. So, that and then some other potential barriers to innovation, I think, are the last couple of points we want to discuss here, because what would you, or how do you think about, I didn't want to, the Kabloom, what's his name? Kaboom?
Tom Kramer
Kablooey?
from Kablooey.
Kablooey. So design your great name. Design your device with reimbursement in mind. Reimbursement's drifting and diminishing and endangered in many segments of the market. So how do you incorporate that into the idea that, you've got to file your regulatory paperwork, you got to prosecute some studies, you got to commercialize this thing, potentially even worldwide at once?
Well, so in our case, what we ended up doing was, those are things which we built into the cost initially itself. And we said, okay, this is how much we are going to be spending on the product development, and our cost points need to be, our price points need to be so low that we can get a large market share. And that way we'll be able to recoup our costs over time. So we are amortizing the costs of development over a larger market. And so rather than focusing only on the US market or the European market, we are saying, okay, we'll go global. And how do we do that? We look at partnerships, etc., globally. So you have, but you have to take into account the CE certifications, the Medical Device Tax Act, etc., and plan that out right up front. And it's not necessarily sitting there and writing it on a paper, but thinking about it and discussing these problems with your team right in the beginning, so that you know what your cost points are. So when I sat down with my team, I said, well, our price point per test needs to be $2. And they said, hey, that can't be done. I mean, if you go and ask your customer everything, that's not going to work either. I mean, as they say, Ford said if he were to ask his customers what kind of a car, what kind of a vehicle do you need? They would have said vehicle driven with a lot more horses. Well, so a lot of times the customers are looking at things from their viewpoint where they are today rather than what's coming down the road. And so we have to start looking at innovation and looking at what the customer needs are and deciphering what that really means, right? From a point of care standpoint, we looked at $2. If we were to try and do this in the US, $10, $20 for the test was not a big deal. But now when you look at Africa, as Mauricio said earlier, or you look at China, or you look at India, my talks with Becton Dickinson was, well, can you do a cervical test for $2 or less? If you can't, your point of care is not going to sell. And so what we went in was looking at that price point, not the cost point, the price point. Can we do it at $2? And we came up with something where we can do breast cancer and cervical and others at $2.
It's huge. Well, so again, that's the value proposition based in the price. Health economists will evaluate your device as well and say, is there a cost benefit, whatever the price is. And, NICE in the UK and a series of other, over here it's going to be the MedPAC does a little bit of this stuff, but it's IPAB, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, and so on. So that's the launch pathway. Think about it, putting in the price. What about the study pathway to look at value?
Yeah, so there's sort of, this kind of goes back to my point about the regulatory strategy and thinking about where you want to pursue, because and in particular thinking about in the U.S. there's some initiatives around parallel review which have some advantages and disadvantages, and FDA is talking about expanding that process. You need to think about, if you're talking about a completely novel device, or you're talking about a device that's going to be a PMA, it's going to be a very extensive study, depending on what kinds of regulatory pathway you have, you may want to incorporate what you would need to support the reimbursement. If you're talking about something that needs a smaller study to establish either for a 510K or to establish what is needed for the regulatory pathway, you might be better served to do 2 separate studies or to pursue the reimbursement type of clinical utility studies separately post-market. And so this really is a strategic decision, and it's not the same for every kind of product or every kind of company. And it may not be the same for every part of the world. You may have a different decision for what you want to do in Africa versus what you want to do in the US, because no one in Africa maybe is going to get, they're going to pay it out of their pocket, so they need a different approach totally. And so a lot of the people that I work with, they have different strategies for different parts of the world, and you want to think about that fairly early on. And one of the things that you want to incorporate in that is that early communication with the regulatory agencies. Was mentioned earlier, I strongly encourage the pre-submission process with the FDA. They love their pre-submission process. With one exception, I've had very good results from it. You learn a lot, and as long as you carry out those plans fairly timely, then it's very valuable. There are similar mechanisms in other parts of the world as well. And so I would really encourage that. But I think that the key thing is thinking about these things early on in that process, not as an afterthought. I worked with a foreign manufacturer who took a long time to convince them that they should talk to my firm early in their development process, not the day before, Natalie, we're ready, here's the 510K stuff, and then they would send me stuff, and we'd spend another 3 months going back and forth because I didn't have what I needed. And they it eventually said, oh, maybe we should talk earlier.
Smart.
And also, I think, which is the increasing competitiveness for the single source and the dual source contracts, having those studies to be able to support any type of comparative claims that you want to make to get your device out there on the formularies, to support sort of those competitive type claims, you're going to have to design your studies with maybe a little bit different studies for those competitive advantages.
I have a question, but first, I had my photographer come around because the three of you watching Natalie intently answer was just like, where's my phone? I want to take this picture. Great picture. Natalie, I understand among your specialties, you're really quite gifted in matters relating to the EU and the regulatory minefield there. My question is, I understand from members of my group, and it comes up a lot, well, we'll launch in Europe first because it's so much easier than going through FDA and clearance and PMA and a lot of other acronyms that go through me. And I've heard anecdotally that the EU is kind of responding to that now and making it as hard as it is.
Yeah, we were just talking about that. So it's pretty traditional, if you will, over the last many years, especially in the in vitro diagnostics world, but other medical devices as well, to go to Europe first. In the in vitro diagnostics world today, under the IVD directive, 80% of the products are what they call self-certified. So it's a pretty darn low bar, if you want to look at it that way. There are many products in Europe which are self-certified for IVD and are PMAs in the US. So that's a pretty big disparity. There is
if I may, this is more for the
for the
people in TV land who will watch this later. Specifically, how would I self-certify? I decide that?
It's analyticals, so in tests, does the test work analytically? So they analytically validate it. Does the chemistry work? Versus a full-blown clinical validation that it is able to change whatever clinical picture you're trying to diagnose.
Excuse me, Connie thinks otherwise. Let's,
Huh?
hold on.
There's more to it than that, though.
Self-certification means that you attest that you have met all of the requirements of the regulation and that the risk of the device, according to Annex 2, which is a list of maybe 14 analytes that have to go through notified body review, is too limited.
Yes.
Right? So things that are PMAs in the United States are being self-certified. That does not mean you don't have to do clinical. You have to meet everything in the directive that's required, but you are certifying yourself. You're making a declaration of conformity that I have done everything.
Right. The biggest thing is that there is not for the ones that are self-certified, there isn't a notified body involvement to review the data like there is an FDA.
Right.
And there is a handful of IVDs that are not self-certified, but as the lady there just mentioned, they are. There's a specific list, and that was a list selected, 20 years ago? I mean, it's pretty close to 20 years ago. And so, of course, it doesn't make any sense for today's world. So what is, and this is what Joe was getting at, is what's been proposed is fairly significant changes to the medical device and
Time frame?
That is the $1 million or multi-million-dollar question.
That's how I roll.
They do not have there'll be a transition period of 3 to 5 years, but the start of that has not started yet because the proposed changes are hopelessly stuck within the parliament in terms of there are many quite significant changes being discussed, and I just looked at a statement about this for someone talking about this last night on one of their blogs or whatever, and they do not have any idea in terms of time frame about when this is going to be started. And about maybe 6 months, 9 months ago, when a lot of these things were proposed, people were saying, we're probably talking about 2017, 2018. But the time hasn't started yet, the phase in, and until it gets out of this sort of stuck nature, it isn't started. So it does leave an incredible amount of uncertainty. There was the picture with the uncertainty. That is a big bucket of uncertainty right now because today's world is one thing. This is going to change. I am sure that many of those things will eventually change, but how many of them and exactly what they'll look like, Nobody knows the answer to it. And that's, even with what Bob was talking about, having your various contacts and everything, this is like looking into a crystal ball.
So
Nobody
would you
has the
say
answer
launch
to it.
in Europe first while the getting's good?
I encourage people to continue with that strategy. For one thing, because even when this changes, they will already have established their quality system. They'll already have a relationship with a notified body. They will be a step up in a lot of cases, because especially in the IVD world, what's going to happen is that maybe it's not going to change from 80% self-certified to 80% notified body. But that's what they're saying. But let's say that some people win and it's only 70% or 60%. You'll be at the lower end of the queue if you've waited. So
Problem also, though, that I've heard reported about this is that there's no grandfathering under those proposed.
no, there is no grandfathering. You'll have to
Risk-based.
You'll have to go forward, and which is a big difference between the U.S. and Europe. In the U.S., once you have your 510K, if you don't change your product,
You're good.
you're good forever.
Nancy, I don't know if you had a chance to meet Peter Havel. Here I am, and here's Peter. He's with Notified Body at TUV SUD. He'll be speaking right after lunch. He had a statement.
Is he going to tell us when this is going to change?
Not exactly when it's going to change, but let's say the amount of unpredictability is somehow limited, because there are two proposals in the European Parliament. Yeah. And you can see already, let's say, the recommendations which are being effective, which will be part of the new regulation, like the unannounced audits, the higher scrutiny over the notified bodies. Yeah, you have seen that the amount of notified bodies has gone down from 89 down to, meanwhile, 62 only. Our prediction is that it will go down to 40. And if you are a high-risk medical device manufacturer, then the recommendation is simply try to read the two parallel proposals that are there from the Council and the Commission, because most likely one of both will become real. Yeah. When it will become real, it's really at the moment not so predictable. We do see that, let's say, the Dutch leadership, which will come next in the European Union, is highly preparing, is talking also to the Team NB, the team of notified bodies, how to implement and how to agree on the new regulation on their legislative. Of course, we had that same story before with the Lithuanian and with the Italian leadership. No, they change every 6 months. However, let's say the Dutch take it most serious. We do see them acting. Yeah. So once that is happening, two things are going on. Yeah. The one is that there will be most likely a 3 years transition period in certain things. The other is that you see that by sending out recommendations, certain things can become effective way more earlier. Yeah. So long story short, if you're a high-risk device manufacturer or if you're an IVD manufacturer, read the proposals, because for the IVD manufacturers, there will be a huge amount of devices which were not regulated, so without supervision, will become regulated and will get supervision. Yeah, and the scrutiny on the high-risk devices will become higher. Thank you.
Probably the best explanation I've heard on that, and I was at a in vitro diagnostic conference earlier this week. Well, it'll be last week now. It blurs together. Hey, so the next kind of roundup, I think, goes back to you, Allison, is this concept again of value analysis and contracting with national tenders. But then in the U.S. there are group purchasing organizations that stand in and contract on behalf of a whole lot of hospitals and or doctors groups. Are there any wrinkles about how you plan and go to market and how you go through your quality processes and so on that can support that sort of thinking? Or is it more of the same?
Well, I guess it's maybe more of the same. I think the point, though, is that maybe the lens is a little bit different when you're looking at really sort of the added value that your device is going to bring to the table. So I think it's maybe the same processes, but maybe a slightly different lens of the endpoint of whether it's the studies and sort of the end game and the message. And also it affects sort of the claims that you're going to develop about your product and what you're actually able to say about the product. So I think maybe it's some more of the same, but with a slightly different lens.
Any variants on that? I think nailed it.
So I it all depends on how you want to market it, right? So whether you want to market it to these groups or there's a different way of looking at it. I think yesterday in the workshop we talked about this. There's, you can look at a push-pull mechanism as well, depending on what you're trying to sell, create a market awareness that the consumers start asking the physicians and others that we need this, right? And once that starts to happen, the groups will automatically start to search you out. And so it's not a straight answer to your question, but I think it comes down to how do you go about marketing ultimately.
Well, and I think you've got some stuff to add to that later on this afternoon. I've got one more question for the group, and then we can let people eat.
Yes, please.
Okay, so for each of you, how and why would we contact you as members of Joe's group?
You know what? That was the question I was going to ask. Seriously.
Well, I guess speaking from the perspective of, an attorney, right? Why would you involve an attorney? Well, I think showing value to your potential investors, for example, having sort of an outside counsel review your regulatory strategy, your regulatory plan, really does show some value when you're looking at potentially being acquired. We work on quite a few due diligence deals, kind of on a regular basis. Sometimes, mostly from this, both perspectives, but largely from the perspective of the buyer, and that does come into play in the calculations that are made. Also, just sort of navigating the tougher issues surrounding your 510K submissions or PMA submissions, navigating that with FDA. And then sort of the third point, I will say, if you are in a post-market sort of situation where you're in hot water with FDA, especially if you're, recalls, whatnot, especially if you're in an inspection, and you hear the buzzwords, data integrity or interstate commerce, pick up a phone. If it's not me, just call an attorney if you don't have one in-house.
Thank you for joining us, Allison. When should we get in touch with you, Sanjeev?
Well, so I'm not a service provider.
I know.
But this is, I think, my fifth startup. So I'm a serial entrepreneur. And if you need any help or guidance there, I can certainly help.
I very much appreciate you making yourself available. Natalie?
All right, so I have a similar thing to Allison, but I'm not an attorney. But my firm, we provide regulatory, both I've done 30 plus 510K since I formed my consulting firm in 2006, dozens of pre-submissions, set up quality systems for a variety of different size startup and larger companies, and we've also done